Yeah, I'll add you guys.
Supervisor Perez, would you like us to begin the housekeeping comments? Thank you. We could begin the housekeeping comments.
Thank you for participating in today's meeting. Please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. Click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you are in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby. For meetings in other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide it to a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items, and times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. Word time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you are authorizing recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Gracias por participar en la reunión de hoy. Si asiste en persona, favor de no conectarse a la conferencia telefónica o Zoom mientras esté en el auditorio y silencie todos sus dispositivos. Haga clic en el icono de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla para seleccionar inglés o español. Se recibirán comentarios públicos después de cada punto de la agenda. Si está en el auditorio y desea comentar, utilice los iPads ubicados en el vestíbulo. Para reuniones en otros sitios, complete una tarjeta azul para su comentario y entréguela a un empleado de South Coast AQMD. Los comentarios serán limitados a un total de 3 minutos o menos para cada punto de la agenda. El tiempo límite puede ser reducido para asegurar que se puedan escuchar todos los comentarios. Se mostrará un temporizador de cuenta regresiva en la pantalla para cada comentario público. Se asignará más tiempo para traducción al español no simultáneo. Si tiene preguntas o problemas sobre cómo hacer un comentario público, llame al asesor público al 909-396-3247. Eso es 909-396-3247. Respete el tiempo límite y favor de tratar a los demás con cortesía, civilidad y respeto. De lo contrario, es posible que se silencie el micrófono o que sea retirado de la reunión. Tenga en cuenta que esta reunión está siendo grabada. Al participar, usted autoriza la grabación del contenido audiovisual presentado durante el evento en vivo y acepta el uso posterior de la grabación en el dominio público por parte de South Coast AQMD.
Thank you, staff. Being part of this conversation, I understand that we have about 38 participants here. At least is what I'm seeing here on the list. And obviously, you're welcome to provide comments when the time comes. And before we talk a little bit about a couple of informational items, meaning the summary of the 5th National Climate Assessment and Air Quality Chapter, by Allison Crimmins and Chris Nolte, as well as what happens at United Nations climate conferences, a local regulator's perspective by Dr. Alberto Ayala, in which neither of the items here consist of a motion. It's more of a hearing, if you will. I'd like to set the tone once again and remind folks why we're here and how we got here. And if folks have access to the minutes, it's basically stated there. And I'm just going to go ahead and take a look at the minutes and read some points that were taken from our last meeting that took place on January 5th, obviously, of this year, and of my colleagues' comments as well that were made during that time. I mentioned, folks, to start up this conversation on climate change was that we have 4 key priorities for this committee, according to me. There may be many more. There may be more from my colleagues, there may be more from staff, there may be more from constituents. Number 1, collaboration and partnerships, and the need for those collaboration and partnerships, especially when we talk about the collaboration between AQMD and CARB. The zero emission infrastructure, obviously the need for more infrastructure, whether they are near our homes or afar, we definitely need to ensure that we're able to electrify, quote unquote, our vehicles and provide that infrastructure throughout the state of California. And us specifically within South Coast Air Quality Management District. The workforce development and the need to ensure that we're able to do everything possible for our youth as well as even adults that potentially are middle-aged that want to move on to another profession, that this could be maybe a prosperous opportunity for them to take on in their work role in a professional setting. And obviously, last but not least, and equally as important, and always is important, and we never stop talking about this, is the pursuing of funding. Obviously, it is necessary in order for us to continue to to move forward, to advance our efforts as South Coast Air Quality Management District, but as well to ensure ultimately that we are reaching our overarching goal. And that is ensuring affordability and ensuring disadvantaged communities are not left behind as we're talking about the green economy, as we're talking about these issues concerning climate change. Now, Supervisor Hagman also expressed back then that, there are limited resources and that pushing too fast could result in businesses leaving the area without significantly affecting climate change. Supervisor Hagman also expressed a desire to coordinate with CARB to level the playing field throughout the state and emphasize the importance that the agency continues to focus on our primary mission. Obviously, points that are well taken, points that are necessary for us to consider and create that balance, especially between industry and our environmental justice friends and allies. Councilmember Caccioli stated the importance of engaging faith-based communities, and rightly so, especially today on Good Friday. Why not? Let's figure out a way in which we can go ahead and engage our faith-based communities and not only our Catholics that are celebrating today, but just every faith-based organization, especially those that are 501c3s that are out there doing good work in our communities. Supervisor Doe stated that climate change is one of the most important issues we all face and expressed support for electrification. Obviously, we all agree with that, and thank you, Supervisor Doe, for bringing that point up for us to be mindful of as we would continue to move forward. Our executive officer, Mr. Wayne Astry, stated that there are many harmonious efforts between improving air quality and climate change, and looks forward to working with the committee on the key priorities that we outlined on that specific day. And so obviously, if you want more details, by all means, take a look at the webcast on that date in order for you to get more information. Now, with that said, we actually had an opportunity to hear from folks like Dr. Alex Hall from UCLA, who talked about climate change impact on Southern California air, and there was quite a bit of discussion after his presentation, during his presentation, specifically, at least for my neck of the woods, the issue of dealing with the Salton Sea. And obviously the mitigation of the dust and how that impacts air quality. Committee Vice Chair Padilla Campos and Vice Chair Caccioli inquired about the interaction between climate change and the weather, and talked about the Santa Ana winds, as a matter of fact, and precipitation and increased severity and hurricanes and things of that nature. Also, we had an overview of regulatory and policy framework for climate change. Dr. Sarah Reese, our Deputy Executive Officer, presented an overview of regulations and policies related to climate change. And obviously, as always, she did an outstanding job, and look forward to obviously working with her as we move forward. Now, once again, Supervisor Hagman commented on the potential for regulations becoming so stringent that our region could become unaffordable and not competitive with neighboring areas. And obviously, we all can agree to that. Once again, it's about striking that balance. Overview of U.S. EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program was also discussed, and that was brought forward by Lisa Tanaka O'Malley. Thank you for that overview as well, Lisa, and definitely appreciate the efforts there. And we talked about the next steps. My hope, although I know we are just beginning this committee, it's been dormant for years. I'm not exactly sure how many, but quite a bit of time now. And, I would like to see this committee to become a standing committee. And obviously, that will take a little bit more effort in the sense of funding and staffing. And not that we don't have the capacity or the skill set, the wherewithal, the knowledge of our staff currently now. It's just the fact that our staff is at capacity when it comes to all the other committees that they sit on, that they're working on, and as well working with our communities. And then, quite frankly, the need for more resources up and coming from Sacramento. And so that's kind of like a context. Just want to provide that background information for those of you that might have missed the first meeting. And obviously, you're welcome to take a look at that information from January 5th. And with that, I'd like for us to move forward with our informational item. Summary of the 5th National Climate Assessment and Air Quality Chapter. But before I do so and ask for that presentation, I just very quickly want to ask my colleagues if there are any points that I might have missed, or my colleagues if there's any points that they'd like to make. Yes,
Mr.
Supervisor
Chairman,
Hagman.
I'd just say that you did a great job of summarizing, so I have nothing to add.
Well, thank you. I learned from the best like yourself, Supervisor. Anybody else? We're good? All right, perfect. So why don't we go ahead and Wayne, who will be introducing Miss Allison Crimmins as well as Chris Nolte.
Yeah, good morning. So yes, wanted to introduce Allison Crimmins. She is the director of the National Climate Assessment. And so she's going to give us an overview of the 5th National Climate Assessment and all of that information therein. So with that, please, Allison, if you could start.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about the National Climate Assessment itself. We use the acronym NCA quite a bit. So if you hear me say NCA, it's the National Climate Assessment. So I'll give you a little background about that report before I hand it off to Chris Nolte to focus specifically on the air quality topics. The National Climate Assessment was released last November, so November 14th, 2023. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about it. The report is delivered by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is a program that was mandated by Congress under the Global Change Research Act of 1990. And we're tasked with assisting the nation and the world in understanding, assessing, predicting, and responding to global change. The program convenes actually 15 agencies. There were 14 while we were developing this report, but we were just joined by the Department of Urban Housing. So we are now 15 agencies. And those 15 agencies all work together to advance climate and global change science and to make sure that we're providing useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide, please. That same law that I mentioned on the previous slide, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, that established our program, also mandates that we release periodic scientific assessments known as the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. So to date, there have been 5 national climate assessments released. These assessments are they're mandated to analyze the effects of global change on a range of sectors. So things like agriculture, energy, land use, health, social systems. You'll see a lot of those topics reflected in our table of contents. We're also charged with looking at observed trends as well as projections into the future for the next 25 to 100 years. These reports are used very widely, not just by Congress, but really by a lot of state and local governments, by organizations and individuals across a really wide range of purposes. So anything from policymaking, risk management decisions. They're used in the private sector. They're used for local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners like nurses, farmers, utility managers, and educators. Next slide, please. So rather than conducting new scientific experiments, our authors review a really large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. So they're going out there and reading, I believe there's something like 8,200 references in this report so that you don't have to read those. Those authors read and review and then synthesize all of that information and help us understand our confidence in the scientific understanding. So what do we know? What do we not yet know? The assessments are policy relevant, but they're strictly not policy prescriptive. So we don't advocate for any particular viewpoints or policy measures. We don't include policy recommendations. This is really just the foundational science. And what we do is use a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that could be avoided or reduced under different scenarios. So we're giving people all the information they need to ultimately make their own decisions about their level of risk, the kind of their risk threshold. The reports are very, they're guided by a lot of very strict rules and acts, including the Global Change Research Act, the Information Quality Act, the Evidence Act, all of these things that make sure the reports are really transparent, accessible, inclusive, and that we are checking all the boxes and dotting I's and crossing T's. And finally, I'll mention on this slide, the report goes through a really extensive review process. And this is part of the reason it takes so long for these reports to be published. We have many rounds of public engagement, but we also conduct an external independent peer review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as undertaking several different rounds of government review, so that what comes out at the end of this very large process, this very long process, is an absolutely authoritative, trustworthy source of scientific information that people can use to inform their decisions. Next slide, please. So there are many new features in this 5th National Climate Assessment, NCA 5. There are some links at the end of the presentation, so you can dig into these a little more. These are a lot of these sort of new products that we developed for NCA 5 are really in service to the idea that we didn't want this to just be a big book gathering dust on a shelf. We really wanted this assessment to be useful and usable and used by a really broad range of audiences. So alongside the report, we held our first ever public call for art. We developed 6 podcast episodes interviewing our authors. We are translating the entire assessment into Spanish. Some of those chapters are available now, and we're hoping the rest will be completed by the end of the month. And one of the features I'm showing on this slide here, we developed a tool called the NCA 5 Atlas. And this is an interactive online tool that lets people zoom into their state or county and toggle different variables of interest. So for instance, if you are interested in how much rain is expected to fall on the wettest day of the year, you can pick that variable. You can zoom into your area. I'm showing my hometown in this figure, but you could zoom into your county and then see how that variable might change under a 2-degree world or a 3-degree world. And then you can also overlay other maps on top of this, like the Justice 40, maps or watershed boundaries, and then print or screenshot the map that you've created. So we have about 400 figures in the report, but if the exact figure you need or want is not one of those 400, you can go to this tool and create the exact map that you want using the same data that we use in the National Climate Assessment. Next slide, please. So in my last two slides here, I mostly want to impart on you how big these assessments are. Big in terms of the number of years it takes to develop, which I mentioned, but also the number of people involved, and really big in terms of the scope of the report. So this slide is a snapshot of the hundreds and thousands of people involved in making the 5th National Climate Assessment come to life. The report itself is written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every single state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, Palau, Micronesia. So really wide geographic diversity of both federal and non-federal authors coming together to write this report. It's managed by federal steering committees, by the USGCRP, by 15 agencies now, and hundreds of staff at these different federal agencies who review the document multiple times during the development. We have a dedicated staff at our national coordinating offices. We have a technical support unit that helps us develop figures and copy edit and build the website and make sure we are dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's. And we also had an 18-person peer review panel from the National Academies that I mentioned before. They reviewed the entire report and wrote a 346-page peer review report themselves that itself was then peer reviewed. So layers upon layers of review. And as I mentioned as well, we have lots of public engagement. We had public engagement opportunities early in the process this time around so that we could really hear from people before a lot of the text was fully baked and on paper already. We could hear from stakeholders really early in the process about what they were interested in and what sort of information they most needed. And that helped us scope the content in the chapters very early on. We had public engagement and public comment opportunities in the middle of the process. And then we're in the midst of a lot of public engagement opportunities, including webinars and workshops, now that the report has finally been released. And next slide, this is my last one before I'll hand it off to Chris. I just wanted to put Chris's chapter a little bit into context of the fuller report. So hopefully you look at this slide and see that there is a little bit of something for everyone here. This is our table of contents. If you start on the left, you'll see we have 2 physical science chapters on climate trends and Earth system processes. The rest of the first column and all of the second column are our national level topics. So those are things that topics or groups of people, but looking across the entire US, which is where our air quality and health chapter fall. You'll also see we have a new chapter on economics and one on social systems and justice. I wanted to just note that though we have this new chapter on social systems and justice, environmental justice was a major theme of the entire report and really a thread that ran through every single chapter. So not just sort of relegated to one place in the report, but really prevalent throughout the entire assessment. Our third column is our regional chapters. We have 10 different regions. And then in the top right, you'll see we have 2 response chapters, one on adaptation and mitigation, as well as a few extra focus features that might be of interest to this group, like a short feature on COVID-19 and Western wildfires. So with that, I think the next slide, I will hand it off to Chris Nolte.
Very quickly, if you don't mind, going back to that last slide, there you go. Thank you for your presentation. Before we move on to Chris, Allison, just a question for you. You mentioned, and I see here highlighted, social justice, social systems, as well as economics. And this is a constant battle, I think, that we have. And you heard me earlier as we set the tone from my colleague, Mr. Hagman, Supervisor Hagman. And, obviously we all have the same sentiment, is that balance between industry and environmental justice. And then obviously the economics of it all. And how do we ensure people keep their jobs? And how do we ensure industry continues to thrive while at the same time, we do our best possible to ensure that people are able to breathe clean air. I'm just wondering, uh, is there anything more you can share on those two fronts there, those two bullet points? Because I think they're all important bullet points, don't get me wrong, but I really do think that those two are the main ones that continuously I hear come up. And whether you can share something on that or maybe staff, just wanted to ask the question.
Sure. Thanks for asking. These two topics really came out of a lot of interest that was expressed from the fourth National Climate Assessment. So when the fourth National Climate Assessment was being developed and after it had been released, we got a lot of public comments asking for more information on these two topics. And so that was really the impetus for adding these chapters to the assessment in NCA 5. In terms of your question and the comment at the beginning of the meeting here, as with previous assessments, the report finds that the economic damages from climate change vastly outweigh the costs of any climate action, often by pretty large orders of magnitude. So the economics chapter does look at the direct damages from economic damages from climate change. It also, I think, goes a little bit further than we've seen in previous reports by talking about some of the impacts of climate change on more indirect economic damages, things like the impact on public borrowing or real estate, or the ability of cities to secure loans, those sorts of secondary economic damages that go beyond just the ones that maybe come to mind right away when you think of a hurricane damaging buildings. So this chapter really dives a little bit deeper than I think we've ever seen before in terms of not just direct economic damages from climate change, but some of those additional ones. And then the social systems and justice chapter is really interesting. We've had lots of requests for years to include more social science in these reports, which of course makes sense because climate change is a human problem caused by humans, felt by humans. It will be solved by humans. So it only makes sense that we have social systems and social science in the report. That chapter had a pretty big lift since it was the first time we've ever included it in the report. Just thinking about what information they could put into one small chapter to try to cover such a large field. But as I mentioned too, this is a report that you see across all of the chapters, includes a lot of information on both the disproportionate impacts of climate change on overburdened and disadvantaged communities, but also the role of those frontline communities in being a part of climate solutions. And so I think that really is representative of an advancement in the science since the last National Climate Assessment. We have a lot more research on those topics, but also an advancement in our social consciousness of just how connected climate change is to social justice topics.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that information. These chapters that you're referring to, many times legislators don't have a lot of time. They're having meetings all day, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and they're able to read a one-pager, if that.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how do you bring up this information to the individuals that are making these policy-making decisions on our behalves so that they can be remembered and potentially even advocate on behalf of? Because if they're long chapters, I can appreciate that, but I just don't know if folks really get into it as much as potentially, having something that might be a little bit less wordy, if you will, not for a lack of better words.
No, I hear you. I mean, if you were to actually read the report from cover to cover, it'd be, more than 2,000 pages long, but I don't expect anyone is doing that anymore. I mean, we put a lot of effort into making sure this report was web-based so that people can very quickly find the information they need. And then as I think you're going to see when Chris presents too, we we structure each chapter around a number of key messages. And so that allows us to very quickly, if someone is only reading one page, they could read just the high level key messages and get those big talking points and big takeaways very quickly. If there's a topic like economics or jobs or, something even more specific than that, like, economics to jobs to I'm only interested in clean energy jobs. The report is kind of structured that you could, in kind of this onion way, that you can kind of dig down into as much of the weeds as you're interested in, or skim across the top and just look at the key messages or the executive summary, if that was a little bit, more where your interests lie. So I've been doing a lot of briefings, a lot of webinars, and some people want kind of the big high level talking points. And then sometimes people want really specific information. And that's where I lean on those 500 authors like Chris, who have a lot more specific information on each of those topics.
Well, thank you for your response and for that information. Definitely, I would think more often than not, we will lean on you as you lean on your colleagues to provide us that information in a succinct message, potentially a pager, one pager or two, maybe even a few. But thank you so much. And if folks don't mind, let's go ahead and move forward with Chris Nolte.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. And thanks, Allison, for setting things up so nicely. Before I begin, I need to emphasize that the air quality chapter was led by Dr. Jason West of the University of North Carolina. So as the federal coordinating lead author, my role was to provide input to Dr. West and the rest of the author team, as well as work with the federal coordinating leads of other chapters to ensure that related topics were cross-referenced appropriately and unnecessary repetition was avoided. The actual content of the chapter was written by our fantastic team of 12 authors and a half dozen technical contributors. In the chapter, we first define what we mean by air quality and why it is important, then discuss how air pollution has changed over recent decades and why it remains a problem in the United States. Our chapter has 5 key messages and 8 figures, and I'll cover each of them in turn. Next slide, please. Our first key message is that climate change will hamper efforts to improve U.S. air quality. We describe how climate change will modify processes that affect air pollutant concentrations. In this figure, factors that will tend to increase ozone and PM2.5 concentrations are in red. Factors that tend to decrease concentrations are in blue, while purple and question marks indicate uncertainty, either in how that process will change or in the response of that to that change, the response of the air pollutants to the change in that process. More frequent wildfires, higher temperatures, and longer heat waves will all tend to increase ozone and PM2.5. Warmer temperatures will tend to increase biogenic emissions, the volatile organic compounds naturally emitted from many plant and tree species, as well as microbes in the soil. And where it occurs, increased drought also tends to increase pollutant concentrations by reducing the uptake of ozone by vegetation and the drying of soils leading to increased windblown dust. By contrast, increased precipitation tends to decrease PM2.5 concentrations by washing the particles out of the air. Other factors, including changes in the frequency of stagnation events, changes in transport patterns, such as a shift in the jet stream, and the effect of increased humidity, have uncertain or mixed effects on ozone and PM2.5. Next slide. Future air quality will depend on both air pollution control measures as well as climate change. This figure shows modeled pollutant concentrations averaged over the contiguous U.S. with the historical period since 1980 in black and projections in various colors for different climate scenarios out to 2100. Changes in annual average PM2.5 are shown on the top, and changes in summer averages of maximum 8-hour ozone are on the bottom. All trends are shown relative to the 2015 to 2024 average values. There are a lot of squiggly lines on this plot. Thick lines are multi-model average values, while the thin lines are individual model simulations, indicating uncertainties in modeled processes, as well as weather variability in each scenario. Historical improvements in air quality reflect the effect of clean air policies. Climate change has the potential to change PM and ozone, depending on the particular scenario. One caveat that is worth emphasizing is that these projections do not include the expected strong influence of climate change on wildfire smoke. Next slide, which sets things up for our next key message. Wildfires are such an important factor affecting recent and future air quality that they are their own key message. I'm sure those on this call or in this meeting know how wildfire impacts on air quality have been increasing, not just with the fires in recent years in California and throughout the West, but also in parts of Canada, with smoke from fires in Quebec affecting air quality in the eastern US this past summer. Wildfires are projected to continue to increase due to various factors, including warmer temperatures and earlier snowmelt. For those interested in this topic, I encourage you to check out the Focus on Western Wildfires section, one of the 5 focused on sections in NCA 5 that Allison referred to, that highlight certain topics affecting multiple regions or sectors. What's new here What's new here in this part of the air quality chapter is really the second half of the key message, the emphasis on efforts to improve public awareness of the risks of wildfire smoke and provide real-time communication of smoke plumes. Here's a figure from the Air Now Fire and Smoke Map for a day during September of 2020, showing smoke plumes extending across much of the country, along with satellite fire detections and reports of the air quality index at various monitoring sites. The authors wanted to emphasize how advances in remote sensing and improved smoke prediction systems, combined with better communication strategies, with daily forecasts and outreach to underserved communities, are striving to protect the public. Next slide. So as Allison mentioned, chapter authors were encouraged to consider environmental justice throughout the report, but different chapters approach that topic quite differently. The air quality chapter chose to make a standalone key message, noting that air pollution is often worse in communities of color and low-income communities. The chapter has a focus box on air pollution exposure to residents in the Houston Ship Channel region, which is a primarily Black, Latino, and low-income neighborhood. Here's a photo showing nighttime industrial flaring near the Houston Ship Channel in the Deepwater community in Pasadena, Texas. And you can see how close it is to the residential area and imagine the frequent exposure to emissions. Next slide. This figure shows the geographic variation in air pollution and temperature across different neighborhoods in Houston. The Ship Channel region is shown outlined in black in each panel. On the left, the largest racial or ethnic group is shown, and you can see where there are higher proportions of Latino and African American residents in that urbanized area. Higher than average levels of NO2 in panel B, lifetime cancer risks associated with air pollution exposure in panel C, and summer temperatures in panel D. For all of these, higher levels are found in neighborhoods that are primarily African American and Latino, especially surrounding the Ship Channel. The chapter notes that there has been less research on the effects of climate change on air pollution inequities, but evidence supports the conclusion that environmental justice communities will, on average, face worsened cumulative air pollution burdens from climate change. And finally, decision-making focused on the fair distribution of air quality improvements rather than on overall emission reductions alone is critical for reducing air pollution inequities. Next slide. Our next key message is that climate change is worsening pollen exposures and adversely affecting health. Climate change has already caused some regions to experience longer pollen seasons and higher concentrations, and these trends are expected to continue with climate change. The figure shows observed changes in total pollen concentrations between 1990 and 2018 on the left, along with projected changes in ragweed pollen between 2000 and 2050 on the right. During the review process, we got some comments from various government staffers, as well as some public comments, questioning why we have a key message on pollen. So just to clarify, pollen is important not just because many people suffer from hay fever with symptoms of sneezing and itchy, watery eyes. All of that is unpleasant, but by itself would likely not rise to the level of being a key message. But rather, pollen allergy is important principally because it tends to cause or exacerbate asthma, which can be fatal. So that's why it's really a topic of particular interest in this chapter. Next slide, please. Our final key message is that policies can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve air quality simultaneously. This is really the most original section of the chapter, with 2 figures newly created by the authors synthesizing a wide body of research. Environmental policies to mitigate emissions will affect both air quality and climate change, and actions can be coordinated to address both problems simultaneously. In this figure, the boxes are arranged qualitatively to show how different environmental policies or actions can be expected to affect air quality on the vertical axis and climate on the horizontal axis. Blue boxes show traditional air quality focused actions, such as vehicle tailpipe or power plant smokestack controls. Actions aimed at short-lived climate pollutants, such as black carbon and methane, are in orange, and white boxes show other types of actions. Emissions reduction actions in the upper right, such as renewable and nuclear energy and electric vehicles, have greater air quality and climate benefits. Next slide. Controls on greenhouse gas emissions also reduce air pollutant emissions from the same sources, which are often fossil fuel combustion, thereby improving air quality and saving lives. Our final figure shows ratios of monetized air quality benefits to greenhouse gas mitigation costs, synthesizing the results from several recent studies focused on the US. Importantly, climate benefits are not part of these calculations at all. This figure is just showing the ratio of air quality health benefits to mitigation costs. In most cases, that ratio is greater than 1, indicating those benefits exceed the mitigation costs, meaning they are worth doing even if you don't care about climate change at all. In some cases, in many of these studies, those benefits estimates exceed costs by a factor of 5 to 10. And so the final conclusion from this section is that the US thus has an opportunity to greatly improve air quality while substantially reducing its climate impact, approaching net zero CO2 emissions. And with that, I'll turn the rest of the report or this presentation back over to Allison.
Thanks, Chris. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. I think we just have a couple slides at the end here with some resources that I'll mention. On our main NCA 5 website, which is nca2023.globalchange.gov, that is the official report of record. So you'll find all of the chapters there. Each of the chapters are loaded with case studies and figures that can be downloaded and shared. We also have a downloads page. And since you mentioned kind of one-page handouts, I'll mention that that's where you could find they're probably more like two-page handouts, but those are all available on our downloads page, as well as slides and figures from all of the chapters, which can be downloaded. We also have our Art by Climate gallery with all of the winning art that was used in the assessment. We, for the first time, included a poem from the US Poet Laureate. She wrote, Ada Limon wrote the poem Startlement, specifically for the report, which you can find on the website. And we have a really helpful glossary, which is already something that's being used across the federal government to make sure that we are using our terms consistently. And since we brought up environmental justice before, I'll note that there are some terms in our glossary related to environmental justice that might be the first time they have official federal government definitions to terms like overburdened and disadvantaged. So those glossary terms are particularly helpful. If you go to our main global change research website, which is globalchange.gov, sorry, one back, please. You can find our podcast episodes. We also recorded an audiobook of the overview chapter, which is our executive summary. So if you don't want to sit down and read the executive summary, but you want to listen to it while washing dishes or walking the dog or something, that is available as well. And then finally, I mentioned the atlas, which you can find at atlas.globalchange.gov. And next slide, please. Now, we did have a series of webinars with every single chapter that began in November and ran through March. We actually have one last webinar left, which is on Monday, and that is on the Art by Climate, so the call for art, where we're actually speaking to several of the artists in that webinar. But if you're interested in going back and watching any of those webinars, there's really big Q&A sessions in those recordings as well. Those can all be found on our globalchange.gov website. We're also hosting a series of in-person regional workshops this spring and summer, and you can find the schedule for those on the globalchange.gov website as well. And I think that's that's the end. So maybe I'll stop there and see if people have questions for Chris or for me.
Well, thank you, Ms. Crimmins, and thank you, Mr. Nolte, for your in-depth presentation. Definitely welcomed. And I wanted to ask if my colleagues might have any questions. If so, let me know. Supervisor Kurt Hagman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fascinating, and a lot of information in a very short period of time. And I'm doing some checking on lines, and you have a great reputation across all fields, which is wonderful. And I think some of the things that I'm looking for, maybe you could speak to, is some policy advice. So we here at South Coast Air Quality, my concerns is, we have one of the tougher air to clean up in the geographical area. How do we all share in this change with different, regulations and rules throughout different regions of the United States, because there's different standards and different population centers? What advice would you give us on this board to pursue the policies that, we want to get to these goals, but it's going to take a lot of investment, a lot of costs, a lot of changes. Can we spread that burden across all of North America in order to help individual climate regions that need more help?
Well, I'll take a soft swing at that before I pass it off to Chris here. The assessment itself does not include policy recommendations. So I can't really, in good faith, give you a policy recommendation as part of my role here. I can say some of the information in the report might be helpful in terms of seeing what has worked in other communities and maybe seeing what hasn't worked in other communities. And one of the really big takeaways across the multiple chapters was how important it is to have the communities who are being affected by these policies or lack of policies at the table and a part of these conversations from the beginning and involved in producing the policies that are going to affect them along the way. And in some cases that can make the process a little bit tougher and slower, but in the end, I think results in a much more efficient process. Maybe, or I should say effective process. Maybe I'll turn to Chris and see if there's anything else you want to add policy related.
I don't have a lot to add. As now Allison noted, the chapter was expressly not policy prescriptive, and so we did not do specific policy analysis for certainly not for South Coast Air Quality Management District or any other part of the country. But I would encourage. I think the last section of the report and the figures that I described that talk about the benefits of greenhouse gas mitigation, the air quality health benefits of greenhouse gas mitigation, showing that even if you totally discount the benefits of climate change, but just looking at the from the standpoint of air pollution damages, there are many mitigation actions that are very much beneficial in terms of their costs are much, much lower than their benefits. So I would start there.
Yeah, I just on some of your charts, you show the areas where shipping is, for example, where there's the ports of entry into North America. There's probably a handful of those. Our Long Beach and LA ports, for example, provide 45% of North America's cargo coming through. So we have the burden for our residents of being that specific port for activity comes in, but the benefits, those goods moving throughout the rest of North America is a broader way of, I guess, they're benefiting from what our residents are suffering for here. So that's the kind of examples I was looking at. Pragmatic. Do we put a per container charge that everyone pays in different states to help, bring in those new resources to help build forward? And I know you're not a policy body, but I'm just thought that with your looking at these things that you may come up with some pragmatic solutions.
Maybe I'll offer too, if there's interest in pulling in some of our authors from the economics chapter or from the transportation chapter. I don't know that they would make you happy in terms of giving you specific policy recommendations either, but they might be able to give you a little bit more detailed information on that. I know the transportation chapter does talk about impacts on jobs in that sector. And across the report, we talk about, one of our major takeaways is that the increase in the number of jobs in the clean energy field far outweighs the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel fields. But those are also those are numbers. Those are not specific people. So the report also talks about the importance of making sure that as we are moving into this energy transition, we're doing it in a just way that is thinking about workforce training, is thinking about how to improve some of the existing injustices. For instance, the energy field has historically left out women and people of color. So how are we addressing some of those injustices as we are moving forward in this just transition? If there are other topics like that, we'd be happy to connect you with authors from those chapters.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Any other questions or points from my colleagues? See none. There is no motion required here, but I'm wondering, are there any constituents that are calling in?
No one has their hand raised, but if you like, you can ask if people would like to comment, if they could raise their hand.
Yeah, is anyone interested in commenting? I see 41 participants, just in case. I just want to make sure that you have opportunity here to speak if you'd like to. And seeing none, I'm like stalling here. Want to make sure that give you that opportunity. We're gonna go ahead and move forward, folks. Just time check very quickly. It's about maybe 7 minutes till 10 o'clock. So we're probably gonna go a little bit over 10, but not too much. Depends on how many questions there may be and the presentation. With that, Wayne, we now have Dr. Alberto Ayala. And you'd like to introduce him or staff member?
Yes, thank you, Supervisor. I'll be very happy to introduce Dr. Ayala. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Ayala join us. In addition to his qualifications as the Executive Officer of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District, he was with the California Air Resources Board for almost 20 years, 17 years, but there he was responsible for a number of programs, including their air quality monitoring program, as well as the state's laboratories. He was also significantly involved with regulations for vehicle emission reductions. And to me, something that's equally important for us as we welcome Dr. Ayala in his presentation is he grew up here in Southern California. And he and I sort of joked because we went to crosstown rivalries. He went to Banning High School, and I went to Carson High School. So he's intimately familiar with the ports complex and the challenges that we face. He is also the co-chair of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies Climate Change Committee. So with that, we welcome Dr. Alberto Ayala.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Wayne, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you for having me, Supervisor Perez. It's a pleasure to join you all and complement this conversation about climate change. I think it's pretty meaningful that we're having this discussion today, especially being Good Friday. But also, we sit here just a short few hours from another very important action that the federal government has just taken by releasing the latest set of greenhouse gas standards for heavy-duty vehicles. So I commend you for creating the space to have this conversation. So I'll go through my remarks quickly to allow you for some questions. I'm sure you have a lot of questions that you'd like to address, trying to help you understand better what it's like to go to one of these COP conferences. And again, just for reference, this is the conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The 28th version of the COP just took place end of last year in Dubai. So what Wayne asked me to do, and I'm happy to, is kind of give you a perspective in terms of what was it like and why did we go. So if we can move to the next slide, please. The venue was Expo City, Dubai, and it was a very adequate venue because it's built to be a small sustainable city. So it was a perfect setting for the close to 100,000 people that turned out to participate in COP. So as you can imagine, it is indeed a sea of people, and I'll explain to you how we all got distributed across Expo City and around the city of Dubai. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I wanted to give you the punchline, if you will, at the very front of my remarks. I'll bookend the presentation by giving you more specifically the takeaways that I believe are important for a local agency, a regional agency like our AQMDs. But obviously, there was plenty of controversy, no secret there. I even shared this article that came out at the beginning of the conference in the Washington Post, kind of alluding to this issue of Dubai is arguably the epicenter of the universe for the fossil fuel industry, and here they are hosting a discussion about climate change and how to take action. And I say all that because obviously no one is gonna argue that the COP process and COP itself is the perfect approach. It is quite imperfect, but I remind all of us that that's all we got. There's nothing else. And having been there and having worked in the climate change space for some years, I can't imagine where we would be if there was no COP. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Obviously, the big thing this last COP was phasing out of fossil fuels and whether it was a phase out or a phase down. And if you come across the official documents that summarize COP28 that came out of Dubai and the presidency there, they talk about this transition away from fossil fuels in a just and orderly manner. And I put quotes on orderly manner. I think to me that's a loaded word, right? Because what does that really mean? And I think that's where you're going to see in the future, this year, leading up to the next one and the one after, the work that remains to be done. One thing that was interesting this year, there was quite a bit of emphasis on increasing the amount of renewable energy that we are producing. And there was a commitment to increase global production by 3 times. And also energy efficiency, and I think that's really important. The energy efficiency world thinks that we could focus on that effort a little more to get more benefit. Something that was particularly interesting to me and a bit surprising is how much attention there was to future technology related to carbon capture and also direct air capture. And it was interesting because we certainly were not expecting it to take such central stage. But obviously there is a lot of questions about it. There's clearly some very important technological advances and demonstrations that are happening indeed, and some of them are happening close to us in our neck of the woods. But there's also skepticism in terms of is it really going to be the solution that we're seeking. The big thing that remains at the global level is really We know what we need to do. We know that we need to get to carbon reductions. The big question is how we're going to pay for it, right? I mean, the emerging economies, rightfully, from my perspective, argue that they did not create the problem, right? It's the rich economies like the U.S. and Europe and others that honestly, we enjoy a standard of living that has been historically very energy intensive. And the last presentation tells you how that use of fossil fuels is manifesting itself in our climate and weather. And the emerging economies are asking, where's the help gonna come from so that we can also begin to tackle the climate crisis. The last point I'll share, which was again a bit of a change for me, was this is the first COP where there has been organized discussion about a global goal on adaptation. If you track the history of the COPs, it's always been about mitigation, right? Identifying the problem, what are we going to do about it, and how we're going to pay for it. This time around, there's already talk about the goal or a global goal on adaptation. And this one is particularly relevant for regions and local agencies like us, because the very tough thing about a global goal on adaptation is that when you talk about climate adaptation, it's very local. There is no solution that you can say, it'll work everywhere. It's a very local problem. And if we're talking about a global goal, I think it's going to be a really interesting policy discussion in terms of, how do you frame where adapting for climate in Sacramento is going to be very different than down in LA, for example, and other places. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to walk you through just what is it like on the ground, and just kind of give you a sense of, my goal here is kind of, if you were there, this is the kind of thing that you would encounter. The first thing to note is when we talk about COP, it's not one single event. It's not one single meeting place where, 100,000 people convene. It's really multiple events that happen throughout the roughly 2 weeks of the COP. And they happen everywhere, inside the formal area, the official area, as well as outside. And one of the first things that you will come across if you attend one of these is that there are many side events. Some of them are actual official side events that happen within the restricted area on a number of topics. But there are also other side events that are equally valuable. And I give you just a sample of some of the ones that I attended. Bloomberg Philanthropies, obviously, they tend to put on very large side events. There was other events on different topics. In the picture on the right, for those of you that may know him, he's our Daniel Kamen from UC Berkeley, who was talking to us in a discussion we had on hydrogen, put on by the Climate Center, just to give you an example. Next slide, please. The actual COP is divided into 3 zones, the innovation zone, the green zone, and the blue zone. So I'm going to start with the innovation zone. And again, this is just a dedicated area where there are many different forums taking place. And on the picture on the left, you can see that there's a listing for a Sustainable Innovation Forum, Sustainable Finance. The one that I attended, that is the picture on the right, is the Hydrogen Transition Summit. Hydrogen tends to be a topic that we're very interested in up here in Northern California. So we've been tracking that. So the Innovation Zone, again, it's open for everybody. You don't need official credentials to join it, and there's always opportunity for very meaningful and substantive engagement. Next slide, please. So then there's also the green zone, and this is a part of the UN setup for the COP. But what's relevant about the green zone, again, is that it's open to the public. And if you've ever attended a technology conference, a technology showcase, for example, think of COP as one of those on steroids. I mean, it is massive. There's lots of technology, there's lots of policy discussion, there's lots of announcements that get made, and commitments and agreements are typically saved for rolling out at a COP, for example. Next slide, please. And then there's a blue zone, and typically the blue zone is the one that is the restricted area. You have to get official UN credentials to participate. And again, in this particular case, as you can gather from the map, it's just the green and the blue zone were right next to each other. It's just a matter of what delegates have access to. Next slide. And this is the official zone. This time around, President Biden didn't attend, so John Kerry was the U.S. representative. But I just sprinkled different pictures here because that's where the official negotiations take place. Policy wonks like myself, I do like to go and observe how those negotiations are taking place. But there's a little bit of for everybody. There's panels that take place, obviously demonstrations, etc. So this is the official zone where to gain access, you have to go through the process of getting credentials. Next slide. And that's where we find ourselves. We are a part of what is called the subnational delegation, right? Because we're not representing the federal government. And we are welcome at a COP because, again, all action is local, as the saying goes. And I think in that context, there's plenty of activity for subnational delegations. And one of the most meaningful things that you find at a COP is really the ability to make connections and talk to people that without a COP, it would be very difficult to do. And the fact that everybody convenes and is focused on how to advance the climate agenda respectively in their locations, in their countries, as well as how do we share and help each other out. And again, I just sprinkle some pictures of some of the panels that the California legislators attended, and obviously on the top is our Sacramento delegation with Leanne Randolph from the Air Resources Board. Next slide. Now, it's not easy to get credentials. It's quite a bit of a process. The way that we have managed it is by working very closely with the Climate Registry and the Climate Action Reserve. So here's our California delegation, our Sacramento delegation. It was basically us at the Sac Metro AQMD, our leadership, our board vice chair is the one that attended, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. And we joined forces with our electric utility, SMUD. But the way that we really made it happen is with the help and assistance from the Climate Registry. We work with them because they are great at helping jurisdictions and agencies like us navigate the credentialing process to get access, and they've been just great to work with. Next slide. So I'm down to the last two slides. So this is really why we attend as a local air agency. Obviously, we're there to learn because I think there's benefit in having humility and knowing that yes, we are Californians, and arguably California has been driving the global climate agenda for many years and is a leader. But at the same time, we certainly don't know everything, and there's a lot to be learned from others who are equally talented and committed to solving the crisis. We're there to share. Obviously, there's quite a bit of interest in terms of the world knows about, again, California, and there's always interest in what are you doing, what are you working on, what is the thing that is making a difference, and what are the things that perhaps are not moving ahead as expected. And then again, I talked about connections. I think that really summarizes why we want to go there. Next slide, please. And these are really the takeaways. This is my last slide for a local agency. COP is meant to bring together not just nations, but also actors from state and regions, organizations, and even the nonprofit world. So I think it is intended to be a convening of everybody who's working on solving the climate crisis. Now, for us, this is the reason we go. Our agency has made a strategic decision that we want to get our leadership, our board leadership, exposed to a COP. Obviously, as you know, just like you and us and many other agencies, we're all very active trying to put in place climate action plans, initiatives, programs, et cetera, that are tackling carbon emissions, and we all have very aggressive decarbonization goals, and we all want to be a part of the solution. I believe very strongly that anybody working in the climate space in a leadership position where you're making decisions on local actions that impact carbon action, they need to have an exposure to a COP. And in our case, our board has supported that strategy. And what we do is we make sure that our board chair has the ability to experience a COP, and our board vice chair has the ability to experience a COP. And in this particular case, Council Member Sarah Kina from the city of Folsom is the one that we took to Dubai with us. And really, the point is simply to break, as they call it, the binary between global versus local action. I do believe there's quite a bit of benefit to really put in context how the local decisions that we make that are making a dent on our carbon footprint, how they fit into the global picture. And I think that's really the main reason why we make the effort to go there. And of course, the last thing is partnerships. You definitely go there and you are going to establish partnerships. In our case, that we'll continue to foster and support in the future. So with that, I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Ayala. I like to, before I ask my colleagues if they have any questions or points they want to make, as well as the public, my understanding is that South Coast Air Quality Management District is the premier, if you would, or the main entity when it comes to air quality issues and mitigation and advocacy throughout the U.S. I may be wrong, but that's how I see it. And I like to think of us as an entity that should be at the forefront of these types of conversations, as we are here at the local level within the Southern region. I believe that we should be having these type of conversations, and our staff, as well as my colleagues on this board, should be representing at the United States level as well as internationally. And so I like for us to continue to grow and move in that direction. And I know that there's conversation about that. But really for the purpose of obviously sharing, but obviously as well bringing back great information that we can figure out how we can put to use into action-oriented efforts here on the ground. Now, I really appreciate the point that's made by the fact that, and it was brought up by Dr. Ayala, how the emerging economies really have not been the economies or the nation states that have caused global warming or climate change concerns. It's really first world nations, and as well even second world nations. You mentioned the U.S. obviously, and Europe, China, these type of nations. And I think their point is well taken, and I think that we too should be accountable at that level because they are struggling, they're suffering as a result of our needs, and not only needs, our wants. Do we need something versus want something? And sometimes here in the U.S., we seem to be entitled. Sometimes we seem to think that not only should we be front and center, but we can be a little bit selfish. And so we need to be mindful of that at a global scale as well as even at a local scale. Meaning this, how do we ensure ultimately that we are creating this balance between our industries and environmental justice, and not allowing, for that matter, policy kind of just being dumped on us, for lack of better words, without funding or basically saying, go at it, work on this, like the issues that we're dealing with EPA, and yet they're not willing to take responsibility. And so, I have an issue with that. I saw there that you said, or there's a quote there, and I'm not sure I'm saying this right, phasing out versus, what was the other point? Phasing out versus, what was that, Wayne? Can you help me out?
Facing down.
Phasing down. Yeah, exactly. I don't see how we're going to phase out, over through policy, all these points that are being implemented or not implemented, that are being decided upon us by the federal government and the state government at a local level, knowing that we have communities that are disadvantaged and don't have the infrastructure. So I tend to think that the phase down approach probably makes more sense now, and eventually get to a point where we can say phase out. Who are we to be so entitled to be passing policy and then getting so decontextualized that we don't recognize those folks that need that extra hand, that need that extra support, so that they can transition, for example, from an F-150 5.0 classic truck to a new Tesla. I don't know. Like, where's the balance? We got to make sure there's always balance. And so I'll get off my high horse and just wanted to put up those points. And Dr. Ayala, muchas gracias. Thank you so much for your points. They're well taken. I really appreciate your points. And once again, let's try to make sure that we have our staff, our colleagues at the forefront of these discussions, because I really believe that we are the forefront when it comes to air quality issues throughout the U.S. Wayne, you want to add anything to any of that?
I think the challenge before us is, how do we address these national and global issues at the local level, as you just described? And there's quite a bit that the air quality agencies within the state of California are doing. Dr. Ayala has been very involved in DC. We are also very involved. Both of our agencies are submitting climate pollution reduction grants, from our last presentation where Lisa Tanaka O'Malley described our effort, our roles, bringing in groups. One of the big challenges, as you note, is working with the local community groups and making sure that the benefits or the resources that are available actually end up in areas where they make a difference. And so as we continue to work on the preparation of those proposals and plans and get the resources, I think for us at the local level, doing everything we can to get those resources from the national level. And there is an unprecedented amount of funds that have been made available through both IRL, Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and BIL. And, we're doing our best, but we're also competing against one another. And I think that is also a challenge that we need to somehow be able to address and sort of look at it. From an air quality perspective, we look at this from a very localized perspective. From a climate, it's also a very broad. And as you note, we see the benefits of climate investments when we're looking at zero emission, because we have the reduced air emission aspect, and it helps us. So what you have seen in terms of the actions of this organization is we are working on the climate aspects, recognizing the co-benefits that we derive for air quality. And by going after the funding and the resources, frankly, which seem to be far greater on the climate aspect than on the air quality aspect. So we'll continue to work with our partners throughout the state of California, work at the national level on all of these issues. And as you so rightly point out, Supervisor Perez, on the international front, where we can take a lot of the experience learned from being on the forefront here in California throughout the nation and do it in a way that respects the dignity and impacts to other nations and countries that don't have the resources that we do.
Well, thank you, Wayne and staff. Any comments by my colleagues before I ask our constituents if they'd like to make any points? See none. Harvey Etter? See your hand raised.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. First, I tried to make a comment on the basic issue, the presentations that were given on the National Fifth Annual Plan. And I think one big thing that I didn't hear is that Dr. Sarah Reese at our last meeting gave numbers for methane compared to CO2 of 20 to 30, 35. And I pointed out that Professor Dr. Emeritus Sir David King, since '88, Professor Emeritus in chemistry and physics at Cambridge University, and point person working with their government for 15, 20 years on this, that the real number is now at least 120. And that's the changes in AR5 using a basis of a set of 100 years compared to 20, 25 to 1 as carbon this group was using of a 20-year basis, because it only lasts 12 in the atmosphere. And recently NASA said that an instance of 9 years, and it lasts over 150 times. Okay. So that's double, and that's carbon dioxide equivalent, and this has got to be dealt with here and nationally. And what's up, folks? The Europeans, we presented this to a meeting with Germany about 5 years ago. We put this in the 16th plan, the Solar New Deal, that everything out of DOE, the Sunshot program, has been ignored systematically. So anyway, that's one thing. I'm sorry, I'm getting involved in this, and so the process that we could not get in, and we cannot see any of the presentations. I've got a phone. A lot of people, low income, whatnot, in the real, got a phone, and in public input, unless someone else makes comments, we're the only ones that made comments last time. And I tried to, express how significant the change. You're doubling using 250 roughly for CO2 and equivalent from everything to having real numbers. We put 780 plus or minus 10, 20% and whatnot, and that was in 16. That's 8 years ago. This is very serious stuff. You're talking about analytics and measurement and no policy. The policy is to cover this stuff up. That's outrageous. I'm a little heated now. I'll try to maybe to make some. I'm trying to remember what I was going to say, but anyway, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Harvey. Harvey made that point. I know he's calling in, but he had the concern about being able to see the slides. I guess if you call, you can't see the slides, though, right? You have to actually Zoom, or how would that actually work? There's no other way to make that work.
Well, you can utilize your phone if it's a smartphone. There is a Zoom app that works on the phone, and you can actually see the slides that are being presented on your phone. I don't know what type of phone Mr. Harvey has, but there's only so much that we can do. And we did also try to look at providing other areas of opportunity, like, for instance, Supervisor Doe's office has the ability for people to come in and to look and comment.
Okay. No, I know technology can work for you or against you.
Yeah.
Depending on what you have access to. I think it'd be interesting to find out if Harvey, you're interested in this. And I'll go out of my way to say this and don't know if we can make this work. But maybe we can talk to legal counsel about it, depending on where Harvey is. I mean, honestly, he is the one individual that engages with these conversations, probably more so than anyone else that I know of. Maybe there's a library nearby him or a location nearby where he can walk towards to be part of these conversations via Zoom. We can educate him how to use it. I don't know that it's possible. I don't know if we could actually do that. Or if we potentially have the resources to provide him a phone that can actually do what we're saying. Might be a little too far off, but just consider how maybe potentially we could figure out a way in which folks like Harvey could actually have access via outside of a policymaker's office. Is it possible to use a library? I don't know. Just a thought. You don't have to answer that now.
We'll
Unless you have
explore
one.
your recommendation, sir.
I'm sorry?
We'll explore what you said.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yes.
Any other questions or thoughts or points from my colleagues before we adjourn today?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Supervisor, I may have comments on the, for board other business, but I'll bring some of it in now, if that's okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Falmich.
So Supervisor, you kind of referred to it, and so did Dr. Ayala. Is Dr. Ayala still on?
Are you still on, Doctor?
I'm still here. Yes.
Okay, so, Doctor, thanks. As you and Supervisor kind of referred to Good Friday and the climate change in the same comments, and I thought about that too. Kind of a question for you. In 2015, just before the Paris Climate Conference, the leader of arguably the largest faith-based community in the world, the Pope Francis, came out with just kind of an apostolic document on climate change. Didn't really push hard, just raised the issue, talked about it, brought it to the attention of the faith communities. Then 1 month prior to this, COP28 in Dubai, also Pope Francis, with his second apostolic exhortation, much shorter, but seemingly frustrated, comes out with another one 8 years later and says basically, 8 years ago, I came out right before the Paris climate change with other big faith leaders, and I raised the issue. 8 years has gone by. Our response has been, he quotes, inadequate. You can tell he's frustrated. And he goes through the disadvantage, what's happening, what you've talked about. So at this conference, did this have any impact? Were there faith, as he did this with other leaders too? Has this had any impact on the conversation?
Thank you for the question. I very much appreciate it. As a Catholic myself, as you would imagine, I pay particular attention to what comes out of the Vatican. Sadly, I didn't see a significant presence there, not only physically on the ground, but I mean, just in the conversations from the faith community. And I think I attribute that to maybe a couple things, and that is, it's not, from my understanding, the Vatican is not active or proactively engaging in the COP setting. I think the way that the Pope has, as you alluded to, has done his part, quote unquote, is through his writings and his statements. But I think to your point, maybe that is an area where the faith community should be thinking about engaging, and again, not just at the highest level from the Vatican, but I mean, locally. I know that in many of our efforts, and your agency is similar to us, in many of our efforts, we are trying to establish partnerships with the faith community because they can be quite helpful for us in terms of our priorities for environmental justice and emission reduction. So I think the point is very well taken, and I'm sure you have further thoughts in terms of perhaps how to approach it. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Caccioli, Councilmember Caccioli. Are there any other business matters that staff would like to bring up, or my colleagues at all?
Mr. Chair, I think what I'd like to do is the last two climate change committees, I think, have been very instructional and very educational and have given us a lot of thought. And in those meetings, you have really given us some really good guidance in terms of things that you would like to see. And you actually went through those earlier today with regards to workforce development, with regards to working to faith-based organizations, with regards to technology development deployment, and then obviously the economic aspect and the equity issues. One of the things that we had talked about was working on the charter for this committee. And what I'd like to do is to come back to the next committee meeting with a draft charter and with some specific recommendations regarding your specific goals that you've outlined. I'd like to have some actual action to report on. And I think that in the time before the next committee meeting, we'll have a chance to do so.
All right, thank you so much, Wayne. Who's
Kurt first and I
Kurt?
after.
No, thank you. And this is fairly new to me the last year since I've been on this committee, these subject matters, but wear multiple hats like many of us do. And they're all seem to be coming together right now. I'm having a difficult time in my different capacities to coordinate the efforts. Sharing with Wayne this morning that we met with, on behalf of the county, Japanese consul and a whole delegation of hydrogen, end users mostly, Toyota, Honda, other things, and some producers. We brought in SBCTA, our county transportation authority, and some of our county staffs and find out, okay, there's infrastructure needs, like you mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman. I also am the incoming president-elect for SCAG, which obviously deals with some of the, the grants and the problems if we don't reach our goals for the transportation and regional planning for Southern California. I also am the representative for San Bernardino County on our IREN, which is the Inland Empire, I don't know what it stands for, but we're going to have lots of resources at this point to spend in both San Bernardino and Riverside on green energy upgrades to civic buildings. I would love to task the South Coast, the staff to get a TAC meeting with maybe that's already existing with multiple of these agencies so we could be on the same page. And collectively, I know we're collectively applying for some of the bigger grants right now, which is a very large grant coming down for Southern California. But each agency should take credit for each of its work and expertise, working together. And I know SCAG works very closely with South Coast on parts of that, but there's also multiple other entities that we sit on and that represent, and to bring that together maybe once a year to say, hey, this is our vision, our plan from the staff, and that all the board members from all these different groups can be on that same page going forward, because I'm kind of the link between all of them. But there's many of my fellow board members in each other committee that may not have that bigger picture in mind.
If I may,
Yeah.
I would suggest that as you have these meetings, if you think there's an air quality component, please invite us to be with you. Now, having said that, we are certainly coordinating very closely with a number of the organizations that you've just described, whether they be SCAG, whether they be the transportation commissions, the agencies that are involved on that. And we're especially so coordinated right now, given the proximity of the CPRG grants that are doing. So working very closely with Ray Wolf, working very closely with Comey from SCAG and others. I would say that if there is an organization or an area that we're not working with, I would be surprised, because that's how much outreach we've been working on these agencies. I do want to coordinate better with your transition as the SCAG president to give you the perspective of where we are. We've been engaged in very intense discussions recently with US EPA as a result of their proposed action regarding our 1997 ozone SIP submittal. So there's a lot of things that are going on that require that coordination. And we're doing it across a variety of different platforms. But to the extent that each and every one of you has meetings where there's an air quality component, whether it's technology, we would love to have somebody there that can certainly at least help us make sure that we're coordinated better and understand some of the things that we may not be hearing directly.
Appreciate that, Wayne. I know the existence of the SCAG and SBCTA. Do we have people at IREN? IREN, Inland.
Yes, actually, Supervisor. So Iron did participate in the CPRG
Yeah,
discussion.
I know we're doing the grant together. I just don't know because they're doing all the green technology over there. And we talked about workforce training. They have a component of their money's going to hopefully train with community colleges, the next workforce. We have paid intern positions to go in the different government entities to be that point link. And right now, it's not a huge budget. It's substantial, like 30 million over the next 3 or 4 years. But with this grant coming through, it could be up to 150 million of that. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, looking toward the same goals, and hopefully add that into our plan going forward, TPA.
Sure, thank you, Supervisor Hager. As a matter of fact, before I ask Mr. Caccioli for his points, as I pointed out the 4 pillars, if you will, I also have a 5th one, which was, my colleagues obviously have other ideas, or staff might have other ideas as to what we can do as a climate change committee, hoping that one day we become a standing committee to obviously continue to grow our efforts. And I think your point is very well taken. I'll say that I know that AQMD has always played a role with, for example, the entities back home in the 4th District. But I really see it now more so than ever before, meaning CVAG, Salt Sea Authority, and maybe a few others as well. And that's because of the fact that I'm part of this board and part of those boards, and just like yourself, and somehow we're able to make it work, right, and put it together. Your point is also well taken around the need for collaboration, cooperation, coordination, all that good stuff. As we continue to move forward, and I don't know if we've ever done this. I know that we have like an event in which it's more of a recognition award ceremony type of event. And I know we have those every year. But I'm not sure we actually put on our own air quality conference at South Coast. And maybe we do, maybe we don't. Maybe I missed it. But let me just put that out there, in which potentially we could invite all these different groups to be part of it, and they can all have workshops, discussion items that pertain to all of us, in which we can all grow in a way which maybe will direct us to get to wherever we need to get to sooner, whatever that may look like, whatever those wins may look like, whatever those victories may look like. It could be a policy platform, it could be more funding, it could be anything. So I'm not saying we got to do this tomorrow nor even next year, because I know of the constraints. But just want to put that out there because I think it makes sense as the top entity in the nation, once again, in air quality. Then why don't we have our own air quality conference? So with that, Mr. Caccioli, and then we'll hand it over to staff.
Mr. Supervisor, I'm thinking along the same lines as you and Supervisor Hagman. Coordination, collaboration, hosting a conference. I'm looking. You must have been looking at my paper. I really want to host a conference here, like as you're talking about, with the faith-based community leaders from our 4 counties, whether faith, religion, philosophies, whatever you call it. Actually, right now, we're in the middle of the season of Passover, Easter, and Ramadan just completing. You've got the 3 most largest religions, or powerful religions in the world, and they're actually all Abrahamic religions. We also have an opportunity here, as you talked about, not only with CAR, but with these communities. You're from Riverside. We've got San Bernardino, Supervisor Dozon from Orange County. I've got LA County. We've got four. I would like to start with the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope, and then we reach out to the other ones too. But with our back, all of us are Catholics, as Professor Ayala mentioned. We could start with meeting with the local parish and go to the bishop or so, and we pull those resources, just an outreach as Wayne's developing this in the next several months, and with the long-term interest of having a conference here. Because that just taking, for example, the Catholic Church, with all the parishes in each community or each diocese, Archdiocese Los Angeles, I don't know if San Bernardino's with Riverside or they're separate, but pulling those, millions of faith people together, and then you reach out to, or at the same time, with our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Muslim, our Buddhist, our Islam, the different groups. For example, I started with a local parish priest. I met with his new pastor. I said, I want to do something different. I want to be the first parish in the United States to do like we did in South Pasadena. Glendale just did last week. Their whole landscape maintenance is now electric. I was in Glendale last week where the entire community, city of 225,000 people, is now the largest American Greens and Alliance, all electric maintained commercial lawn equipment. I told the pastor, I brought him the leaf blower. He was using it. He loved it. I had to meet with the leadership of the church. There was, of course, as in any church, there was disagreement. I sat there and brought it up, and there was people said, no, we can't do this. The poor gardeners, the poor gardeners are nailing this. So they're looking at it now. I'm going to meet with them again. But I'm going to set up a meeting with the bishop. We've done this years ago. We had a faith outreach, but we didn't have the resources really. But I think under this umbrella, this is a great opportunity. And one of the many groups you're inviting, I can see Kirk going to the bishop. Ultimately, you going to the bishop in Riverside, Supervisor Doe, and I'm going. We have our local bishops now for San Gabriel Valley because it's so big in LA. But really say, hey, they don't really know what to do. As I sat down with these priests, they don't really understand it. And they don't want to be Democrat or Republican. They just want to do something about it because the Pope said, we've got to do something. But they don't know how to act, Manny. They're not sure. He said, I don't know what to do. How can we do this? I know nothing about this. But I think all of our resources in the Ford County, we have the ability to start there and move on and incorporate that as we working with them, showing them examples of technology, cars, trucks, lawn equipment, whatever it is, and then have a big conference here with all the leaders and the pastors and then they can really disseminate it and work on all the faith community. What do you?
Appreciate that, Mr. Caccioli. So Wayne and staff, sorry. But we're just adding more stuff here, but it's good stuff. It's good stuff. It's good problems to have, as John Lewis might have once said back in the day. And so, obviously we're not asking for this to happen tomorrow. I know it's going to take time. And I also appreciate the point that you are looking into making this committee a charter and honestly, maybe this conference concept can fall under this charter. And so any last points you'd like to make, staff or Wayne?
I just wanted to make sure that my staff behind me was still alive, that we
I'm looking at them.
didn't
I don't know.
commit
Looking at me
some
with a happy face
ritual
or,
suicide. I very much appreciate your comments and suggestions. And what we will do in the intervening time is to try to come up with some recommendations and some realistic timeframes in terms of how we could respond. I think you all know that there's a number of issues that we're working with EPA that are extremely critical, that will have a tremendous impact on our region if we don't solve. We've got some very challenging indirect source rule efforts that we're also working on, as well as a schedule on various SIP submittals and rural developments. So that's my way of saying we have a lot on the table, and very much appreciate your thoughts on how we can expand our ability to influence both at the local, state, national, and international scale. So I appreciate Supervisor Perez, you're giving us the time to come back to you with something reasonable, and we'll do so.
Thank you, Wayne. I know that we had public comment earlier. I don't think we need to do that again. Is that correct?
We have one hand raised.
That's Harvey Eder. I'm not sure if he raised his hand again.
I'm sorry? General public comment. It's under general public comment, so he would have the opportunity.
Okay. Harvey, did you have any last comments you want to make? Okay, buddy, take care.
Yes. Am I being heard?
Yes, you are, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Good morning. I didn't say this before. My name's Harvey Eder, and I'm talking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. I want to incorporate now what I haven't heard, and I was disappointed with. I've been disappointed, and I've stated this for years. This 40% for equity that the ACT group came up, you know, the low income advisory to the White House one night. Our understanding is that this means 40%, like in 617 communities, you know, poor folks and minorities. They're going to get 40% of the systems that are financed will go into their areas and will lower the emissions, and they'll have less disease and suffering. All right, excellent. But we've completely forgotten, and it goes right here from local River City up to this COP thing that happened where the oil companies were orchestrating this thing. By the way, IRENA is their personal solar renewable group. There was a IEA that had been around for 20, 30, 40 years, International Energy Agency. Anyway, this is an aside, but this whole thing about, in 28, the guy that was there saying, he goes, well, we deserve to have a place at the table and discussing whether it's under or off. And yeah, side comment, the vernacular from the street, 6 foot under the table, i.e. out west, Boot Hill. Enough. Where do they get the chutzpah, the balls, to do this stuff? This is outrageous, okay? That 40% has got to be turned into equity, ownership, control, decision-making. That happens with public power. We've got to invite and involve, like we have now with 618, the unions, the local utility, the public power, the community groups. Now we're talking about the church, okay? There's been a whole history of the Crusades and everything else, okay? I got cautious signs going up. I want to bring one thing up, Dostoevsky, okay, the Grand Inquisitor, where Ivan talks to Alyeska, and Jesus comes back 500 years ago, and the Grand Inquisitor says, you come back, we're going to have to kill you in the morning. And he says, we're not with you. Don't look at me that way. We're not with you. We're with him. It's a book on tape. Check it out, incorporating by reference into the record here, all right? A little dissenting thing. All right. Also, before I forget, I want to also incorporate Geniuses by BBC of the Ancient World and of the Modern World. The Ancient World is a Socrates.
All right, Harvey, I think we got it. Thank you so much, staff, my colleagues that called in, as well as my colleagues that were able to attend here physically, and our constituents that listened in. Appreciate it. Our next meeting date is to be determined. And last but not least, I gave my staff the day off after 12 o'clock for Good Friday, even though they may not be Catholic. So with that said, no pressure on our staff here, but or Wayne, but in any event, thank you all. This meeting is now adjourned.